Hello, everybody. Welcome to our conversation today. Today's discussion is the third and final dialogue in a series of conversations to commemorate 30 years of the Human Development Report. This anniversary is happening at a very unique time. This moment has unveiled and exacerbated some of the critical global challenges of our time: inequality, urbanization, technology, and climate change. For this dialogue, we will explore the creative thinking to solve these interlinked challenges. My name is Professor Claudine Moore, and I'm your moderator today, and I am delighted to have a panel of phenomenal leaders and experts to explore and share some of these bold ideas and ambitious solutions to these global challenges. And of course, we have you, our audience, and you are all invited and encouraged to participate in this conversation by submitting your questions for our panelists throughout the conversation. We'll be taking your questions throughout the conversation. We also encourage you to use the hashtag 30 years of HDR. That's 30 years of HDR to share the conversation over social media. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists, and I'd like to start by introducing Danica Littlechild. Danica.
I want to thank the organizers and fellow panelists for our event today, and to recognize all of you for being here with us. My name is Danica Littlechild. I'm from Neasqueyak Ermineskin Cree Nation in Musqueam and Treaty 6 territory in Canada, and I am currently an assistant professor at Carleton University Department of Law and Legal Studies in the Faculty of Public Affairs, and live in the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe in Ottawa, Ontario. And I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. Hi, thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Connie Enshemenire.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Claudine. My name is Connie Shemerere. As you've heard, I'm from Uganda, and I'm an educator by training, working on the relevance, adequacy, and quality of education. I worked as a university academic for about 15 years, but for the last 4 or 5 years, I now work at the interface between research and policy, especially with early career researchers, to make sure that the science gets into the policy making cycle. As such, I am a member of the Global as well as the Uganda National Young Academy, and I'm really happy to be here. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for joining us, Connie, all the way from Uganda. Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Karen Roland.
Hello, I'm Karen Roland, just as you said, Claudine, thank you. I'm Deputy Mayor of the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, and I'm in charge of culture and the 15-minute city in her team. You may have already heard about the 15-minute city, which concept was invented by scientist and professor Carlos Moreno. Carlos has been working upon this concept for quite a while, and for the first time in political history, Anne Hidalgo grabbed the concept just after the election in spring and decided to make it a local policy in Paris. I'll be delighted to talk to you about it a bit later in the talk.
Thank you, Karen. And finally, I'd like to introduce Hauke Engel.
Thanks, Claudine. Hi, everyone. My name is Hauke Engel. My background is actually in astrophysics. I did my PhD on black holes, but then quickly realized that there's somewhat more pressing issues we as society have to deal with right now than exploring the mysteries of the universe. So I joined McKinsey, the consultancy where I now work on sustainability and climate change. Been doing so for the last decade, and trying to help stakeholders to come together and to unleash the power of the private sector as the engine of innovation and delivery to solve this big societal challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Hauke. I'm loving the fact that we have a truly global panel today. I think we have Canada, we have Uganda, we have Germany, and we have France, and I'm talking to you live from the UK. Before we start this conversation, I would like to hand over to the Human Development Reports Director, Pedro Conceição, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you to all the colleagues joining us on this panel, and to all of you following us online. Let me start by speaking of one of the challenges that we are going to address in the discussion today, which has to do with inequalities, to bring us back to the 2019 Human Development Report, where we documented that some inequalities are actually, in human development, are actually wide and growing. Especially as they relate to aspects that once could have been regarded as not essential, but are becoming new necessities. For instance, when it comes to access to the internet, with COVID-19 pandemic, we realized that makes a difference between people being able to participate in the labor market and kids around the world in having access to formal education. Now, inequality in one way or another was always part of human development reports over the years. And this shows that even though human development reports took on different topics, inequality intersects with many other challenges. Again, in the report last year, we showed how climate change can exacerbate inequalities in human development, and also how technology can both open new opportunities, but also generates risks that can widen inequalities if they are not well managed, if those that have access to new technologies such as artificial intelligence can take advantage of them while others are left behind. So I'm mentioning some of the topics that are going to be part of our discussion today, but this interaction between inequalities, climate and technology do not take place in a vacuum. They take place increasingly in cities where more and more people live around the world, and in local communities in many places. So that's why we decided to bring to the debate also the context of urbanization, considering the concrete ways in which this interaction between inequality, climate, technology takes place in cities and in local communities around the world. So with that, I look forward to the debate, to learning from all of you, and to continue the conversation on human development going. Thank you, Claudine.
Thank you, Pedro. So just once again to our audience members who are joining us, and I can see several of you are already making comments and greeting us from all over the world. I can see panel, I can see audience members from Sri Lanka, from Algeria, from Cornell, New York, Cornell, USA. So again, welcome to the audience, and from Iran. I love the fact we have, and Botswana. I could go on and continue listing everybody from where you are, but thank you all for joining us. And without further ado, let's hear from these panelists. I'm excited to start this conversation. So I'd like to start with you, Danica, if I may. Let's just start from the beginning. You have mentioned that we need to have a, in the context of this conversation, or conversations and challenges, you have mentioned that we need to have a fundamental shift in the way that we see the natural world. Can you elaborate on that and maybe provide us with some examples?
Yes, I think part of the challenge is that we continue to face rising global carbon emissions, rates of global biodiversity loss continue to escalate, and we're also seeing concomitant developments like social and economic inequalities widening, as was mentioned by Pedro in his opening remarks. And we're also seeing sort of a prevalence of social movements. We are seeing an amplification of diverse voices in regards to the natural world and how we view our relationship to the natural world. And so I think that connection between some of these environmental crises and social injustice is really being strongly expressed and broadly accepted, I believe. And so many people believe that the time is running out for incremental approaches, and that we need sort of a transformative moment, a transformative shift in the way that we think of our relationship to the natural world. And for Indigenous peoples, and of course, there are over 470 million Indigenous peoples in all regions of the world. It is vitally important to bring that ethic or set of ethics that could be transformative in terms of how we think of relationality to the natural world, as opposed to thinking of it as something that's utilitarian, understanding the kind of reciprocity and the importance of relationality moving forward in that context.
Yeah, Danica, you mentioned there are 470 million Indigenous people around the world. Just for our audience, Indigenous people, what do you define as Indigenous people?
There is no one singular definition of Indigenous peoples, and there's an S at the end of peoples that took 11 years actually to negotiate in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but they are generally peoples who were indigenous to their lands and territories prior to the era of colonization and dispossession and appropriation, which unfortunately continues to this day. And for the most part, the UN system promotes a self-identification process.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the lessons, do you think, that we can learn from Indigenous activism and rights movements that can inform some of the challenges that we face today?
Well, I think one of the important lessons that we can learn is around expression of different values, different knowledge systems, different ethical approaches to the way that we think about development. And certainly in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it is incumbent on the United Nations and its bodies, including the UNDP, to ensure the application of the declaration and follow up on its effectiveness. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples contains the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And so when we think about their advocacy and various movements around rights of Indigenous peoples or the natural world, Mother Earth, we can see that trying to move beyond basic, incrementalist approaches to improving progress in the context of development is vital, and recognizing appropriately historic injustices due to colonization and dispossession is of particular importance. Recognizing also sort of the dignity and diversity of cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations are vitally important in the context of sort of contributing to the development of institutions and sort of the information that we use to arrive at what we understand in terms of human development as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you. And we will, I mean, everything you mentioned there could be another webinar within itself, but we will come back to some of these ethical approaches in some of these challenges, ethical solutions to some of these challenges as well. So I think that's extremely important as we move forward and we consider humans in terms of human development. Thank you, Danica. I'd like to pass over, if we can, to Karen. If we can, Karen, I think when I look at the panel, I think you are the only policymaker on our panel today. So it's great to have you and have your perspective. Now, what do you think the role is of the city in facing these challenges, such as inequality, climate change, and embracing technology in an inclusive way? What is the role of the city within all of that?
I'm not sure the city itself has a role, but policymakers, associations, inhabitants have a great role to play. And this is one of the great things we learned from last year's, not only in Paris, but in huge metropolises as well. We just can't do without inhabitants. And this is the only way we will be able to recreate links that may have been damaged by excesses before, by believing too much in ideological liberalism, for instance. I'm sorry, I'm a left-wing, I'm not sorry, but I'm a left-wing deputy mayor. I have to do with it, and I'm proud of it, indeed. So in Paris, we work about upon the 15-minute city concept, just because we think it's a way of recreating link. It's a way of struggling against inequalities, and it's a way of recreating something. It's also what is at stake is, of course, as well the climatic issue, since we are struck by it just like any other town. And we think that by working upon this idea of the 15-minute city, we can make people live better, have actions that will pollute less, and recreate democratic links that we may have been close to lose in the last decades.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those of our audience members who aren't familiar, can you provide some information, just some background to what is this Paris's 15-minute city initiative? For those of the audience who are not familiar, what is the 15-minute initiative, and also what the what the thinking was behind it?
As I said before, Carlos Moreno, who is a scientist, invented the concept. And the 15-minute city is a quite straightforward idea. It aims at doing so that inhabitants of huge cities are able to meet their essential needs within a 15-minute walk, bike ride, or public transit from home. By essential minutes, we mean housing, food, work, learning, healthcare, leisure activities. So if you are able to cope with these essential functions within a 5-minute ride or walk, we already noticed that people live better, closer to one to another, and closer to their needs as well. That's what we want to develop. That's what we want to implement in Paris in the 6 coming years.
I mean, it's just incredible to think that you can live in a big city such as Paris and everything be sort of 15 minutes, 15 minutes away from you. And I think, do you think this model can work for other cities as well? Like I was doing some research and I saw that Melbourne in Australia, I think they're testing a 20-minute city.
Indeed. First of all, I have to say that it's a proposal. Everyone has to be to feel free to go somewhere else and to choose to cross Paris or New York or Melbourne, far from each city, if it's a choice. What we want to do with the 15-minute city is to lower the level of constraints. But as you mentioned, Melbourne, some of the international greatest cities in the world have already begun to work about it. One point to mention and to underline is that in Paris, just like in Melbourne or Barcelona or some other cities that already worked about it, we do not start from scratch. I mean that in Paris and in all the cities we mentioned before, we've been investing for several years already in social housing, in support to local shops, in public transportation and public amenities. It's not what we call in French a white sheet, page blanche. We work upon strong basis, and we have to go forward, to go faster, to coordinate it, and to make this proposal, but it's not compulsory. What we have to have in mind when we talk about the 15-minute city is that it's a principle of freedom, of liberty, We want to make things easier. We don't want to add constraints to people's life, which are already in a hectic pace and which have to be made easier rather than adding constraints once again.
No, that's great. And I think, you know, I'm glad that you emphasized that point, because I think it's important that, you know, when we're talking about this, as you said, that, you know, it's a principle of liberty. And I love that phrase, because when you think of a 15-minute city, immediately you think, oh, okay, I can't go anywhere else. But when you define it in that terms of a principle of liberty, you know, everybody should have choice, and that's it sounds like a fantastic idea to me. I'd like to go to Dr. Connie Enchemenere. Let's talk about education. Your research on learning skills has shown that if foundational skills are not well developed, that higher level skills are even more difficult to develop. So in terms of education and these challenges that we're facing, what does this tell us about some of the interventions that are currently needed?
Yes, thanks, Claudine. So yes, indeed, the problem we had before the universal education movement is that a lot of children were out of school, but now with the universal education movement, a lot of children are in school, but they are not acquiring the skills that they should. And the main reason for this, to me, is what has happened is that the policy making process is informed by a development paradigm that says that there's an average state of the sub-Saharan Africa region, which is made up of 48 countries, mind you, and that is the state that should drive the decisions in each country. And so that they say, okay, by date X, all children should be in school, ignoring what the local conditions are. So the idea around the higher level skills, it's said that the country's higher level skills are the most important in that country's development, and I don't argue with that, but it's really useless to put resources towards that when the quality of people entering is poor, or when the average quality of the population is so low. Because when children go to school and don't acquire these skills, or they drop out without acquiring them, then to train those that get to the higher levels, who will usually be those from a certain socioeconomic background, is really setting the whole country up for problems. So for me, a more sustainable approach would be for us to take more responsibility as countries, as individual countries, to determine what our own development looks like, and to accept that we have to build it up step by step. We really have to come from the foundations, because without the correct foundations, everything you're building is going to collapse sooner or later. So this is what's happening.
And I think in terms of talking about things collapsing, I think in the current climate that we're in, and I'm referring to obviously to this global pandemic, it really has, as I mentioned at the beginning, it really has exacerbated some of these inequalities, and these inequalities and the potential collapse of not only just industries, but industries, sectors and communities. And in line with that, in the world of now we're living in this COVID-19 world, learning has moved online. And the solutions that you advocate for are for some of the solutions you advocate for, because you advocate for lots of solutions, because there are lots of solutions to many complex challenges. You advocate for well-educated teachers and new school books, for example. But do we not need new solutions for these new times? And if we do, what are they?
Yeah.
And if we can stick to some of the old solutions, what of the old solutions are we sticking to and doubling down?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, we need new solutions, and COVID-19 has exposed a lot of the cracks in education systems like our own. Because when you say that education has moved online, actually in a country like mine, where we have maybe 25% of the population having access to electricity, even if you were to say tomorrow that we can provide a computer for every person, how would they be powered? So while technology certainly offers a lot of opportunities, again, context matters. And I think another way that we can also widen our thinking about technology is that it's not all about AI or internet. Technology is also, of course, a way of solving a problem in an appropriate manner. So you can purify drinking water, that needs technology. You can figure out how to increase the fertility of a soil, that's technology. So that's the first issue. And so what does that mean for how we can go forward? It's, you mentioned that I talk about the traditional ways of dealing with the issues, so more schools or more teaching. So the issue is that since we cannot get online education to all children, then we have to again deal with the issue from where we are. And one of the issues that we already have is that the education, the teachers that we have to have this, the teachers have to stay there because we have to have this person who translates the education for the child. Because a lot of, and again, back to more appropriate books. I don't really mean new school books. I mean appropriate school books, because a lot of the books we have access to represent reality that is not universal. It's not a reality that the child understands or has experienced or is in a language that they understand. So that we still need these people to translate it to our reality. So it's about a step-by-step use of technology, not simply the way technology is helping everyone everywhere else.
Okay, thank you for that, Karen. Yeah, it's education is key. And it's interesting because thinking about the topics we've been speaking about so far, Indigenous peoples, we've been speaking about policy and urbanization, we're now talking about education. These are not in silos, these are all very much interlinked. And later on, we'll be talking about how these all interlinked and how these connect. And in terms of where these things interlinked, the private sector is key in the sort of in interlinking all these different areas. So with that in mind, I'd love to go to Hauke. Hauke, you are the voice in the panel of the private sector, and it is a very important group, as I mentioned. So not only in terms of how we achieve this inclusive, sustainable development, but also in social development. And I wonder, just in terms of your experience and working with different clients in different sectors, are companies moving fast enough?
Well, they're definitely moving, right? I think we can debate endlessly whether they're moving fast enough. They can probably move faster, but I think that they're definitely starting to move, right? So if I look back kind of 10 years and look back 2 years and look back in the last couple of months, the speed is picking up. So I think we definitely see an increasing speed towards more sustainability, more social responsibility, high levels of engagement from the private sector. But of course, right, we need more. So I think is the speed enough? Well, I think that's not mine to judge, but I think I'm heartened by seeing that we see more and more happening and businesses realizing and living up to the societal responsibilities they have, and joining forces with others in the ecosystem.
Yes, I mean that's like the perfect response is that, we are moving, but are we moving fast enough? That's the debate. And I think from some people's perspective and prism, we're right on time, and to many others, we are way behind. So I definitely understand that. So businesses are both affecting climate change, and they're also affected by its consequences, Hauke. And so has this realization changed the way that the private sector, that the private businesses are operating from your perspective?
It has, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the fact that climate change is now, like the physical manifestations of a changing climate are now really noticeable has also made a difference. But I think the bigger factor really is that stakeholders are increasingly expecting this from companies, be it their employees, be it their customers, be it investors, be it the public at large. So I think this is now business leaders are realizing this is a material business issues, and hence they're reacting. So I think the manifestation of that is evident. And I think the realization is increasingly sinking in and being acted on. Yeah.
Thank you. We actually are having some questions, lots of questions actually from our audience for the panels. So just a reminder to the audience, we are going to be taking questions throughout the conversation, and also to do share over social. The hashtag is hashtag 30 years. 30 years development HDP. Did I get that right? Let me just check my notes to make sure I got the hashtag right. Definitely want to make sure we got the hashtag right. 30 years of HDR. Hashtag 30 years of HDR. And we're going to go and take a question. This question is one to Karen from Jamie Prudencio. I hope I got your name right, Jamie. Jamie Prudencio. And his question is this: how can we create a 15-minute city in developing countries with mega cities where people have to travel 2 and 3 hours to get to work? This is actually, thank you for that question, Jamie, because this is a question that I had for you as well. Having experience living in some of these mega cities in developing countries, it is, I mean, you are traveling 2 to 3 hours sometimes, and that can happen in developing countries as well. So how do you is this idea only viable for new urban areas, or is this idea viable for many different settings? Karen. Thank you, Jamie.
Maybe we have to pronounce Jaime, don't you think so?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you said, Karen.
Maybe we have to pronounce Jaime Prudencio. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's just for him. That's an excellent question, and that's why I mentioned before that when we began to work about the 15-minute city in Paris, we felt we were ready to do it because we had led policies, public policies before that allowed us to have basis to do so. We have social housing policies in Paris. We lead important support to local shops, to public transportation and public amenities, as I said before. And in the question Jaime asked, it doesn't start from the same place. He's talking about cities that grew very quickly, sometimes without being enough conceived, I've said, and that had to face globalization, so that it will be more difficult in this kind of places to go to the 15-minute city. But I think it's a way of thinking. It's a method. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of acting towards inhabitants with them. That's a very important point in the way we act in Paris. We won't conceive the 15-minute city alone from our county hall and decide anything. We have to respect what people say about their way of living, and that is also a basis. The two necessary bases are the policies that were led before, are their basis to build upon, and the listening of the wishes of the inhabitants. On this basis, you have to listen to what they say, to build indicators, new way of assessing how people live in cities, not only in terms of wages, of revenues, of economic data and figures, but also in a sensible way to hear them and to invent new things with them.
Thank you. Yes, it's that is actually it was a great question, Jamie. Thank you for that. And thank you for that response. It's almost like it's a blueprint and it's a goal. And if it's not 15 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it's 30 minutes, but the principle of the 15-minute city is something that one we could try and emulate around the world. I do understand that. We have another question, and thank you. This question is coming from Professor Bulenega and Emilia Marquez de Perez. And this is a question to the entire panel. So feel free for anybody to ask this question. What do we anticipate, I guess, but what will the long-term impacts of the pandemic be on SDG progress of the Sustainable Development Goals? What do we anticipate some of the long-term impacts on progress will be? And how do we combat increases in inequalities as a result of the pandemic? So inequalities has already been an issue, exacerbated by the pandemic. How do we, open to the entire panel, how do we go about combating this from each of your perspectives?
If I could just quickly respond to that, I think, as was mentioned, gaps and inequalities have deepened in the context of the pandemic. And I think what we've seen as well is sort of a bit of a retreat from what we had previously seen in terms of a little bit of movement towards intersectionality in terms of the way that we understand the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I had the privilege of being part of the negotiations as a member of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group in the context of the SDGs. And I can tell you that we started out with references to Indigenous peoples in like 9 of the goals and ended up in just being in 2 at the end. And I was so reassured so many times by many diplomats, we won't forget about Indigenous peoples, we won't forget about Indigenous women, we won't forget about gendered Indigenous perspectives and all of this sort of intersectional way that we experience development or lack of development. And I can tell you that it really feels like this has been forgotten. And I feel like the pandemic has caused us to have a bit of a chill in terms of the way that we think about implementing goals and targets like the ones that we've seen described within the SDGs in the context of real lived experiences of people, because there's a tendency now to sort of be really reductionist and highly focused and saying, well, to accomplish real progress, we need to just focus on this one discrete issue and not think about it in terms of the way it is experienced by people in different ways. But my fear is that when we take that approach of reductionism and lack of focus on intersectionality in terms of experience, what's going to happen is sort of the erasure of the possibility of expressing things in a diverse way. And that is really sort of my fear moving forward. And I think we have to be very intentional and deliberative about making sure to make the space for a lot of diversity of voices without being afraid of doing that in the context of sort of building back after the pandemic and thinking about how that might contribute to the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Danica. I'd like to, this is an open question to the entire panel, actually. And I'd like to hear, from your individual perspectives, because you're each going to have a response to the question I'm about to ask, but also in response to what your other panelists are saying, because I'm sure you're going to have different opinions. But our conversation there's been an assumption that the current challenges we're talking about are interlinked. We sort of started off with that premise that these are interlinked. Does this mean that we can start anywhere? Like, where do we start? Do we start with policy? Do we start with Indigenous peoples? Where do we start? And does that mean because these challenges are interlinked, we can start anywhere? Or are there, in your opinions, from your unique perspectives, some issues that are more acute and more important than others? I mean, we all think our perspective is the most important one, but truly, from where you all sit, where do we start? What's most important? I am going to turn to Hauke, because I think the private sector always likes to think they lead everything. So
I hope not. I hope not. I thought I was going for ladies first, so I kept stum, but happy to lead. So look, I mean, I'm not sure if the question should be asked, right? Because there's no need to prioritize, right? I mean, there's many of us. We can fight on many fronts. So I think let's fight on as many fronts as possible, because as you say, like, we can tackle many things in parallel rather than in sequence. But to give my very subjective answer here, right? If I had to pick an issue, I would pick climate change, because it is kind of a multiplier on many other issues, be it inequality, gender rights, etc. And because it is pervasive, it really matters everywhere and to everyone. And finally, because it's very urgent, right? Because of the physics of the changing climate, we have a rapidly closing window for action. And it takes a very whole of society response to tackle. So that would be if you force me to pick one, I would pick climate change.
Climate change. Connie?
Yes, Claudine, I like Hauke. I guess I'll choose education every time. But more seriously, I think for nations like my own, for that developing world, obviously all these issues are a problem. Women empowerment, climate, soils, education, everything is urgent. Youth unemployment, population growth, disease, name it. But I think what COVID-19 has done for us is really a moment for us to reset, and when we've been cut off from the rest of the world, we've been forced to really see all the cracks in our own system. So I think the very first thing that we really need to do is to take back our power as people, because we have a very outward looking way of doing things. We are always looking for these ready-made solutions from somewhere else, but they simply don't fit.
Right.
And so for me, the very first thing that we have to do, the most urgent thing that we need to do, is to change our perspective and know that there are solutions that are better fitting all around us, and also be bold enough to discard the things that really do not work. So I think that would be for me, I would think this change of perspective is really the most necessary.
Yeah, I agree with you. Change of perspective and really understanding and being sort of, as you said, being bold enough to say what you're suggesting is not going to work in this context. Because often it's like you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. And it's being bold enough and confident enough, I think, to be able to say that. And then to be able to say what will work and glean from it what will work, and sort of, customize what won't. Thank you for that, Connie. So Karin, the same question to you in terms of where do we start? What do you see as the most important perspective, or the most important place to start, if you have one?
Of course I do. I think we just can't do otherwise than what Hauke said. We have to face the climatic changes first. The climatic issue is global. It's like a new globalization. We talked about mondialization on a commercial point of view in 20s and 15th and 20th century. Now we have to do with climate change first. On a day-to-day perspective, I'd mention education and health as well. And that's what we do in our local policies, including in the very unprecedented momentum we're facing with the health crisis. So first of all, climatic changes, and on a daily perspective, health and education.
Yes, health and education. Thank you for that. Danica.
Yes, I think it's incredibly difficult to try to pick a singular approach or solution. And I think while some of the issues that my fellow panelists have highlighted are important, what strikes me is that there's an important nuance that needs to be described, which is that if we continue to perpetuate the past paradigms that we've used in the context of development, in the context of environment, in the context of health or education, where we don't make space for diverse voices, for different knowledge systems to come into play besides the dominant ones that continue to sort of like, one of the questions was about like, how can we progress if English is the only language that these kinds of conversations can happen within? If we don't highlight the importance of these types of things, then I think even in addressing climate, we're going to continue to perpetuate an incrementalist approach that has never served us well in the past. We can look at the whole history of the UNFCCC. How effective really has that system been in helping us to address these challenges? So maybe we need to think about systems change. Maybe we need to think about how what is our modus operandi? How are we engaging with each other? How are we relating to each other? And how are we potentially perpetuating systems which don't serve us and don't serve the natural environment very well? And I think that that's where one of our fundamental challenges is going to be. If we want to engage in climate change dialogue where states are the ultimate arbiters of decisions around what happens moving forward, then I think we may continue to see sort of the primacy of things like capitalism and state-led economic development and that kind of thing. And we're not going to see the kinds of changes that actually help people who are highly impacted by things like climate change. And we're not going to see fundamental shifts in the way people experience environmental injustice, for example. We need to start making those linkages for ourselves. If we don't, I feel like we're failing ourselves moving forward.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. That's very powerful, Danica, and absolutely, because one of the next things I was going to ask you all is some of the mistakes that have been made. But you've just highlighted a lot of mistakes in terms of just things not being, or voices not being heard, or people's not being heard, or voices not being heard, or perspectives not being heard. And that is really, really important, especially when it comes to climate change, because especially in developing markets, those are environments that are most affected by climate change. And they're not necessarily the biggest, they're not necessarily the regions that are the ones with the biggest perpetrators of policies and activities that are affecting climate in a very negative way. Any other comments from the panelists before I move to a question from the audience?
Yes, I really wanted to agree with Danica about this incremental progress or change being inappropriate, because in the education sector, for instance, we are always trying to improve or reform the education system. But for me, we are just trying to improve something that just does not work essentially or fundamentally. So I would definitely agree that that we just need a reset. We need a rethinking, because it's when you say have more children in school and you're not rethinking what is that school like, you're just making a small problem even bigger and solving nothing. So I would agree with Danica.
Yeah. Hauke, you're nodding your head there.
Can only agree. Yeah, sorry. I get more valuable airtime, but I'm nodding in agreement.
Yeah, you were emphatically nodding your head there, absolutely. So we only have a few minutes left. So just to the audience members who want to ask some questions, now would be a good time to do so. But I do have a question here, and this is a question for, this is for Danica actually, but this is from Gaona de Fahico. The question is this: how can we make sure that while important, universal education doesn't have a negative impact on diversity? That's actually a very interesting question. That universal education doesn't have a negative impact on diversity. This audience member is from South Africa, and they're saying that from the South African perspective, they are concerned that children lose their mother tongue as formal education is done in English, which is exactly what you were saying, Danica.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree with the premise behind that question. And I think part of it is understanding how to empower local communities and Indigenous peoples moving forward. How can we ensure that there is some level of autonomy in expressing the resilience that actually exists in these communities, and in the languages, the incredible diversity and richness of those languages around the world. And I can tell you that these languages are incredibly and inextricably tied to the natural environment and to the places and spaces in which they are spoken. And so when we support language development that is mother tongue language, that is Indigenous language, etc., what we are doing also is we are supporting the protection of environment, because as long as these languages can continue to be spoken, they can be connected and connect people to ideations about responsibilities, about stewardship, about connectivity to the natural world that don't otherwise exist in sort of the colonizers' languages of English or whatever other language you want to point out. But I think that that's really important. And I think language is so powerful. I mean, we're here speaking in English in this webinar, and even the way that the kind of descriptors that we use and the way that we express ourselves is very tied to some of the sort of the cultural values that come out in the English language as well. We may not be able to express the kind of knowledge and culture that exists in our mother tongues, like in my own language of Cree. For example, in Cree, water is the Cree word for water is nipi. Nipi means nia bimatisuin, which means I am life. And so we conceive of water as animate, as having an aspect of autonomy, an aspect of personality. And this is something that I think, a lot of people in their different mother tongues can relate to. So I would definitely support that question.
Thank you for that, Danica. So I'm acutely aware of the time, and I would like to invite each of our panelists, just from your perspectives, we're talking about some of the great challenges of our time. We are collectively in a very challenging environment. If there was one solution or one solution or one initiative that you know of that you were working on, that you think will have a powerful impact in the weeks, months, or years to come, what would that be? And if we could have, like, in 30 seconds or less from each of the panelists, we'll start with Karen.
30 seconds or less for a mandate of 6 years. The first thing we are going to do in Paris is opening schoolyards to inhabitants, away from times when scholars are in schools. And I think it's a real interesting idea to allow people to go to these places away from times when they have to learn something or do something. They can go there and just breathe and wander around or meet people with one another. It may sound like a small thing, but it's a way of changing our way of lives in cities and recreating links. We much talked about listening to others today, and I think it's a major aspect of what we have to do all together in the coming years.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Hauke, the same question to you.
Yeah, I would. There's no specific initiative, right, that I would highlight beyond perhaps one that we are engaged in right now, right? And that is the attempt to further increase our sense of connectedness and shared humanity across the globe, because ultimately that's what's going to make change, right? That we realize that we're all in this together.
Okay, brilliant. And Of course, you did that, and you did that in 20 seconds. Thank you. Thank you for that. And then I'd pass it to Karen. Sorry, Connie, sorry.
Yes, I was wondering who's Karin. Yes, because I'm involved with early career scientists in becoming more engaged with society, I think in Africa, one of the most wasted resources are our best educated people, and they do not really bring their knowledge beyond the university. It's an old idea, but it's actually something that I think can make a lot of difference if these very well respected, educated people can become more engaged in responding to the realities around them. So that would be what I'm working with.
Thank you for that. And Danica?
I think I'll return to the title of this webinar, which is the last 30 years of the Human Development Index. And I'd like to say that I think that the HDI has really left a lot of people out over the last 30 years. And I think one of the most important initiatives in that context is to start to recognize initiatives within data. For example, for Indigenous peoples, we look a lot at what we call data sovereignty, taking back control over indicators, over the type of data that is generated about us, without us. We need to empower those kinds of voices. Folks like Desi Rodriguez Lone Bear, who's working in the United States on data sovereignty, organizations like the First Nations Governance and Information Center that is totally Indigenous run in Canada. We need to start empowering those organizations to help us to understand what the inequalities really are moving forward, so that we know what the baseline is in real terms and in real lived experiences.
Thank you for that, Danica. That's actually a perfect last comment for this session. So, an idea that changed the world, 30 years of human development reports. As you've heard, there are many complicated and complex challenges that need very bold and ambitious and equally complex solutions. We are celebrating the 30-year anniversary, and in closing, the launch date for the 2020 Human Development Report will launch on December 15th of this month, December 15th. And the registration to follow the launch event will open on the 3rd of December. And for all the future details, you can follow the profile at HDR UNDP or at the website hdr.undp.org. I'd like to take this moment to thank each of my panelists. Thank you to Karen for joining us from Paris. Thank you to Connie for joining us from Uganda. Thank you for Danica from Canada. And thank you to Hauke from Germany. And thank you for putting on this webinar. And thank you for all applying these bold and ambitious solutions to some of the biggest challenges of our time. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to the audience for the questions.